If you walked the streets of Caracas in 1955, you would have been forgiven for thinking you were in a tropical version of Los Angeles or Paris. The city was a testament to a specific kind of aggressive modern wealth. The skyline was piercing the clouds with brutalist concrete skyscrapers, monuments to a future that seemed guaranteed. The Hotel Tamanaco had just opened, a modernist jewel carved into the hillside where American oil executives, European aristocrats, and Venezuelan generals sipped whiskey and discussed the price of crude. The highways were 6 lanes wide, filled with the latest Cadillacs and Buicks imported directly from Detroit. The currency, the Bolivar, was so rock solid that it was preferred over the US dollar in some parts of the Caribbean. Venezuelan tourists were famous in Miami. They were the ones who would point to a television or a refrigerator and say, "Ta barato, dame dos." It's cheap, give me 2. At a time when much of South America was grappling with feudal agrarian systems, military juntas, and crushing poverty, and while Europe was still sweeping up the rubble of World War II, Venezuela had the 4th highest GDP per capita on Earth. It was wealthier than Japan, wealthier than Spain, wealthier than China. It was the Venezuela Saudi, a miracle of the modern world. But this miracle was not grown from the soil of Venezuelan labor or industrial innovation. It was a miracle injected into the veins of the country by a foreign power. Venezuela wasn't just a rich country, it was a company town, and the company was the United States of America. For 50 years, the relationship between Washington and Caracas wasn't just an alliance, it was a symbiosis. The United States provided the technology, the capital, the engineers, the consumer goods, and the security. Venezuela provided the oil that fueled the American century. It was the engine room of the West. From the jeeps of World War II to the suburban heating systems of the 1950s boom, American power was burning Venezuelan fuel. Today, that same country is a scene of devastation that rivals active war zones. The skyscrapers are dark, hollowed out by rolling blackouts. The 6-lane highways are potholed and empty, save for old buses dragging themselves forward on bald tires. The oil rigs in Lake Maracaibo, once the jewels of engineering, are rusting hulks, leaking black sludge into the water. Millions of people have fled, walking across the Andes Mountains in broken shoes, fleeing a hunger that has stripped the average Venezuelan of 20 pounds of body weight. The standard narrative we are fed is simple. Socialism killed Venezuela. A charismatic dictator took over, spent all the money, printed too much cash, and destroyed the economy. And make no mistake, corruption, incompetence, and authoritarian mismanagement were the arsonists that set the house on fire. But they didn't build the house, and they aren't the ones who locked the doors to prevent the fire trucks from arriving. To understand the true scale of this tragedy, we have to look past the easy headlines. We have to look at the other set of fingerprints on the murder weapon. This is the story of how the United States built the most promising economy in the global South, addicted it to a single resource, integrated it perfectly into its own financial system, and then, when the politics turned sour, used that very integration to strangle it. This is not just a story of economic failure, it is a story of a 50-year betrayal. The story begins before the skyscrapers. It begins in the mud. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was a forgotten backwater. It was an agrarian nation of cocoa and coffee plantations, fragmented by geography and ruled by local warlords. It was poor, isolated, and riddled with malaria. Then came the Zumaque 1 well. In 1914, on the eastern shores of Lake Maracaibo, a geyser of black crude shot into the air. It was the kind of strike that changes history. But there was a problem. Venezuela had no way to get it out. They had no drills, no refineries, no tankers, and no engineers. The dictator at the time, Juan Vicente Gomez, was a ruthless pragmatist. He knew he was sitting on a fortune, but he couldn't touch it. So he made a decision that would define the next century of Venezuelan history. He invited the Americans in. He didn't just invite them, he rolled out the red carpet. Gomez worked with American lawyers to draft the country's petroleum laws. The laws were incredibly generous to foreign capital. They offered low taxes, long leases, and total control over the extraction process. The giants arrived instantly. Standard Oil, Gulf Oil, and Royal Dutch Shell descended on Lake Maracaibo. They didn't just build rigs, they built a country within a country. Because Venezuela lacked infrastructure, the oil companies built it themselves. They constructed roads, ports, power plants, and hospitals. They built oil camps for their workers, fenced-in communities that were legally Venezuelan soil but culturally American. Inside the camps, there were baseball diamonds, commissaries selling Hershey bars and Coca-Cola, and cinemas showing Hollywood movies. This was the beginning of the cultural colonization of Venezuela. While the rest of South America was playing soccer, Venezuelans started playing baseball. While their neighbors drank wine or chicha, Venezuelans developed a taste for Scotch whiskey. A class of Venezuelan professionals emerged. Engineers, accountants, managers, who were trained by Americans, spoke English, and viewed the United States not as an imperial overlord, but as a partner and a model. By the 1940s, the transformation was total. World War II cemented the bond. When the Nazis threatened the Atlantic shipping lanes, ensuring the flow of Venezuelan oil became a matter of national survival for the U.S. The U.S. Navy patrolled the Caribbean to protect the tankers. Venezuela became the gas station of democracy. The royalties from this oil flowed into the pockets of the government, and for the first time, the Venezuelan state became rich. But it was a distorted wealth. The Dutch disease began to set in. Because the oil sector was so profitable, it sucked all the capital and talent out of the rest of the economy. Why farm coffee when you can drill oil? Why build a factory to make shoes when the oil money makes the currency so strong that you can import better shoes from Miami for half the price? Venezuela stopped producing. It started buying. It became a nation of consumers, entirely dependent on the dollars flowing in from the north. They were rich, but they were helpless. They had sold their economic sovereignty for a lease on a Cadillac. The 1950s and 60s were the party years. Under the military dictatorship of Marcos Pérez Jiménez, and later under the nascent democracy, the oil money was used to modernize the nation at breakneck speed. This was the era of sowing the oil. The idea was to use oil revenues to diversify the economy. They built massive hydroelectric dams, universities, and aluminum plants. But the dependency only deepened. By the 1970s, the geopolitical ground was shifting. The Middle East was rising. OPEC was formed, and ironically, it was the brainchild of a Venezuelan, Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso. He saw clearly that the oil nations were being ripped off by the Seven Sisters, the cartel of Anglo-American oil companies. He wanted to restrict supply to raise prices. In 1973, the Arab oil embargo sent prices skyrocketing. Venezuela, which did not join the embargo against the U.S., suddenly found itself swimming in cash. The government of President Carlos Andrés Pérez found itself with more money than it knew how to spend. This was Saudi Venezuela. The government nationalized the iron industry. They subsidized everything. Gas was practically free. Food was subsidized. A scholarship program flew thousands of Venezuelans to U.S. universities. Then, in 1976, came the big move. Nationalization. Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. The American flags at the oil camps came down and the Venezuelan tricolor went up. PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, was born. In most countries, nationalization is a violent rupture. In Venezuela, it was a business deal. The government paid the American companies compensation. More importantly, they signed technical service agreements. The American companies stayed. They kept the technology running. They kept the marketing channels open. PDVSA was designed to run exactly like a private American corporation. Its executives were the same men who had worked for Exxon and Shell. They wore suits, played golf, and prioritized efficiency over politics. They prided themselves on being a state within a state. They were efficient, yes, but they were also disconnected from the reality of the poverty growing in the shanty towns surrounding the cities. The U.S. was comfortable with this arrangement. As long as PDVSA kept the oil flowing to the refineries in Louisiana and Texas, Washington didn't care who owned the paper titles. The machinery of dependency remained intact. Venezuela's heavy crude oil is difficult to process. It is like sludge. It requires specialized refineries. The U.S. built those refineries specifically for Venezuelan oil, and Venezuela built its pipelines specifically to feed them. It was a technological marriage that no political decree could easily break. But commodity cycles are brutal. In the 1980s, the oil price crashed. The Saudi-Venezuela dream collapsed. The government, which had borrowed billions against future oil revenues, went bankrupt. In 1983, on a day known as Black Friday, the currency crashed. The middle class saw their savings wiped out. The trips to Miami stopped. The scotch dried up. For the poor, it was worse. They had watched the skyscrapers go up, but they still lived in ranchos, brick shacks perched precariously on the mountainsides, often without running water. They had seen the wealth, but they had never touched it. In 1989, the government, desperate for cash, turned to the International Monetary Fund. The IMF demanded austerity. They demanded an end to the subsidies. The price of gasoline and public transport rose overnight. The result was the Caracazo. In February 1989, the poor descended from the hills. They looted shopping malls and grocery stores. They burned buses. It was an explosion of decades of pent-up rage. The government responded with brutal force. The military was sent in. They opened fire on their own people. Estimates of the dead range from hundreds to thousands. This was the wound that killed the old Venezuela. The democratic pact was broken. The people no longer believed in the system. And in the barracks, a young lieutenant colonel named Hugo Chavez was watching. Chavez launched a failed coup in 1992, which landed him in prison but made him a folk hero. He went on television for 1 minute to surrender, and he famously said, "Por ahora," for now. That phrase electrified the poor. Here was someone taking responsibility. Here was an avenger. In 1998, Chavez swept to power in a democratic landslide. He was not just a politician. He was a phenomenon. He spoke the language of the street. He was dark-skinned, like the majority of the population, in a country where the elite had always been white. He promised a revolution. He promised to take the oil wealth and give it to the people. Washington was nervous, but hopeful. They thought Chavez would be another populist who talked big but would eventually fall in line. They were wrong. Chavez didn't just want to reform Venezuela. He wanted to break the American grip on Latin America. He called for a multipolar world. He befriended Castro in Cuba, Gaddafi in Libya, and the leadership in Iran. He began selling oil to these countries at preferential rates. But the real war was domestic. Chavez knew that to control the country, he had to control the money. And the money was in PDVSA. The executives at PDVSA, the state within a state, hated Chavez. They saw him as an uncouth barbarian who was going to ruin their efficient company. The conflict exploded in 2002. The opposition, backed by the Business Federation and the private media, launched a coup. For 47 hours, Chavez was removed from power. He was held captive on a military base. A business leader, Pedro Carmona, declared himself president and immediately dissolved the Supreme Court and the Constitution. The United States government, under George W. Bush, was one of the only nations in the world to rush to recognize the coup government. They thought their problem was solved, but they underestimated Chavez's support. The poor poured into the streets, surrounding the presidential palace. Loyal military units counterattacked. The coup collapsed. Chavez returned to the balcony of Miraflores Palace holding a crucifix. But the mask was off. Chavez now knew the U.S. wanted him gone. He purged the military of disloyal officers. And when the PDVSA executives launched a massive strike in 2002-2003 to try to force him out, he fired them. He fired 18,000 highly trained employees, geologists, engineers, managers. He replaced them with loyalists. He famously blew a whistle on television shouting, "You're fired." This was the moment the economic rot began, though it was hidden by high prices. By firing the experts, Chavez destroyed the institutional brain of the oil industry. But in the short term, he won control. He took the oil revenues and poured them directly into social missions. He built clinics, schools, and subsidized markets in the slums. Poverty plummeted. Inequality dropped. For the first time, the poor felt they had a government that cared. Chavez was a god to them, but to fund this, he needed maximum revenue. In 2007, he moved against the foreign companies again. He demanded they migrate their projects to joint ventures where the state held the majority. Most companies accepted. But ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips, the American giants, refused. Chavez didn't blink. He expropriated their assets. He seized billions of dollars of heavy oil upgraders in the Orinoco Belt. He told the Yankees to go home. It was a massive nationalist victory. It felt like justice, but it was a strategic suicide. Venezuela was now running its oil industry with political loyalists instead of engineers, and it had kicked out the companies that possessed the technology needed to keep the heavy oil flowing. Production began a slow, steady decline, but nobody panicked because oil was at $100 a barrel. The cash covered a multitude of sins. The party was back on, but this time, the poor were invited too. The tragedy of Venezuela is a tragedy of timing. Hugo Chavez died of cancer in March 2013. He died just before the bill came due. He was succeeded by his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was a former bus driver and union leader. He lacked Chavez's charisma and his military authority, and he had the worst luck imaginable. In 2014, the global oil price collapsed. It fell from over $100 to under $30. Venezuela's economy was a one-trick pony. Oil accounted for 95% of export earnings. When the price crashed, the money vanished. But the debts Chavez had racked up remained. The social programs became unsustainable. The government began printing money to pay the bills, triggering inflation. Scarcity set in. The shelves went empty. This is where the U.S. strategy shifted from containment to strangulation. In Washington, the Obama administration and later the Trump administration saw a weakened prey. In 2015, Obama signed an executive order declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. It was a legal formality needed to impose sanctions, but to Venezuelans, it sounded like a declaration of war. The initial sanctions targeted individuals, generals, ministers, government officials. They froze their bank accounts and revoked their visas. The logic was to pressure the elite, but it didn't work. It just made them dig in deeper. In 2017, under President Trump, the economic warfare went nuclear. The U.S. Treasury Department imposed financial sanctions. These were designed to cut off the government's access to credit. The sanctions prohibited U.S. banks from purchasing new Venezuelan debt. This was the trap. Venezuela was in a cash crunch. Normally, a country in this position would refinance its debt, issue new bonds to pay off the old ones, buying time to restructure. The sanctions made this illegal. The global financial system is dollar-based and passes through New York. By blocking access to U.S. markets, Washington effectively blocked Venezuela from the world. Maduro's government was strangled. They couldn't borrow money to import food or medicine. They couldn't buy spare parts for the oil rigs. The production of oil plummeted further, not just because of incompetence, but because they couldn't pay the service companies who maintained the wells. The final blow, the kill shot, came in January 2019. The political situation in Venezuela had devolved into chaos. Maduro had won a re-election that was widely considered fraudulent. The opposition leader, Juan Guaido, declared himself the interim president, citing the Constitution. The U.S. immediately recognized Guaido and decided it was time to push Maduro off the cliff. They dropped the nuclear option, sanctions on PDVSA itself. For a century, through coups, dictatorships, and Cold Wars, the oil trade between Venezuela and the U.S. had been sacred. It was the one thing that was never touched. Now, the U.S. banned the import of Venezuelan oil. This was catastrophic. The U.S. was Venezuela's biggest cash customer. While Venezuela sent oil to China and Russia, that was mostly to pay off debts. It didn't generate fresh cash. The U.S. market was the cash cow. Overnight, the revenue went to zero, but it was more technical than just sales. Venezuela's heavy oil is too thick to flow through pipelines. It needs to be diluted. For years, Venezuela imported diluents from the United States to mix with their sludge so it could be exported. The sanctions banned the sale of diluents to Venezuela. It was a masterclass in economic destruction. The U.S. stopped buying the oil and simultaneously stopped selling the ingredients needed to produce the oil. The impact was immediate and horrifying. Oil production crashed to levels not seen since the 1940s. The economy contracted by nearly 80% in roughly 7 years, a collapse unprecedented in peacetime. The humanitarian cost was medieval. With no government revenue, the water pumps failed. The electricity grid, starved of maintenance, collapsed, leaving the country in darkness for days at a time. Hospitals became death traps. Without electricity, incubators for premature babies shut down. Dialysis machines stopped. Surgeons operated by the light of cell phones. The U.S. seized Citgo, Venezuela's refining subsidiary in the U.S., freezing its assets. They handed control of these assets, on paper, to the opposition government of Juan Guaido. The idea was to starve the Maduro regime of resources so the military would flip. The military will not starve with the people, the logic went. They will turn. But the calculation was wrong. The military didn't turn. The top generals were already sanctioned. They had nowhere to go. They knew that if the regime fell, they would be in prison or extradited to the U.S., so they stuck with Maduro. The sanctions, intended to split the regime, actually welded it together. Instead, the burden fell entirely on the civilian population. Hyperinflation reached 1,000%. People began burning money for warmth because the bills were worth less than firewood. A migration crisis exploded. Over 7 million Venezuelans fled the country, the largest displacement crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The story of Venezuela is complex. It is undeniable that Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro dismantled democratic institutions, mismanaged the economy on an epic scale, and allowed corruption to rot the state from within. They fired the experts, they seized private property, and they bet the house on oil prices staying high forever. They built the pyre. But it is also undeniable that the United States lit the match and then poured gasoline on the flames. The sanctions were not a surgical tool. They were a blunt instrument of collective punishment. A report by the Center for Economic and Policy Research estimated that the sanctions were responsible for tens of thousands of excess deaths by restricting access to food and medicine. The betrayal was total. The U.S. spent 50 years building Venezuela into a dependent petrostate. They shaped its consumer culture, designed its refineries, and integrated its banking systems. They encouraged the very dependency that made Venezuela vulnerable. And when the political winds changed, when Venezuela tried to assert a clumsy and aggressive independence, the U.S. pulled the plug. They weaponized the interdependence they had created. They proved that the golden handcuffs of the global financial system are real. As long as you play by the rules, the system makes you rich. But if you try to break away, the system can simply turn you off. Today, Venezuela is a zombie economy. Maduro remains in power, ruling over the ruins. The U.S. has quietly eased some restrictions, realizing that the maximum pressure campaign failed to effect regime change. But the damage is done. The oil infrastructure will take decades to rebuild, if it ever can be. The lesson of Venezuela is a chilling one for the rest of the world. It shows that economic sovereignty in the 21st century is an illusion for small nations. You're only as rich as your relationships allow you to be. And in the game of empires, a partner is only a partner until they become a target. The United States helped build the Paris of South America, and when the time came, they helped turn it into a graveyard. Thanks for watching.